my name is Christina McGahay. I am Tyco Community Alliance's Executive Director, and I'll be presenting today on fiscal sponsorships. This session is meant to be a really high-level introductory conversation about fiscal sponsorship. As you can imagine, it's a very complex thing, and everyone's need of sponsorship or use of sponsorships can look very different. So this is as general of information as we can make possible. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, of course, they can always contact me directly or info@tycocommunityalliance.org. So getting started really with grant applications, tax-deductible donations, it can be kind of a scary thing. And many groups or individual Tyco artists don't have the 501c3 benefit or umbrella over their heads to have access to a bigger pool of resources, right? In those times, we would want to have a fiscal sponsor. So let's get started with today's presentation. I'm going to outline very quickly what a fiscal sponsor is and why you would want to use one and what use cases would make sense for you. There are many different types of fiscal sponsorship models. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And with those different models, depending on your sponsor, that could be the difference between you owning the IP of what you create or them. So it's definitely something we want to talk about and address today. There are good versus bad fiscal sponsors, just like anything else, right? Not every fiscal sponsor is going to be created equal. So we want to talk about maybe some red flags to be mindful of and consider. Also, we want to avoid funneling, identifying what that is and how we're going to avoid that. I'll share some brief tips and tricks from my experience working on both sides of fiscal sponsorship, and then we'll open the rest of this session for question and answer. So what is a fiscal sponsor? Many artists, musicians, community groups are not tax exempt, like I said. This means that you can't apply for grants from your state agency, which gets big federal money, right? So these are the people that are like, you have to be a 501c3 to apply. Also, if anyone wants to support your art and donate to you, if you don't have a tax exempt status, you cannot give them a tax deduction for that donation. For some people, this does not matter. They're going to support you anyway. But for quite a few other donors, they appreciate that tax deduction and it motivates them to donate to you more and more frequently. So for artists and groups that want to have access to these things, they typically have two options. They become a nonprofit themselves, or they partner with a fiscal sponsor. Becoming a nonprofit themselves is, of course, a great plan. It gives you a lot of control and autonomy of how you choose to operate your business of Tyco, right? But for some people, that can be a longer process to accomplish than they realize. And they want to apply for a grant that has a deadline in a couple of weeks. So what do you do? So a lot of people end up going back and forth between these two options, depending on where they're at in their situation or in their Tyco group situation. A fiscal sponsor is a company, usually a nonprofit organization, that serves as the sponsor for an artist or a group. So companies that are only in the business of providing sponsorships exist. There are a handful of those out there that do this fiscal sponsorship as like their product or their service to the community, and that's all they do. Then there's other organizations like TCA who do it as an additional part of what we do for the community to enhance our mission. So fiscal sponsorships for us are something that we just started delving into earlier this year. So this is the pilot year of that program for us. And so far we have 2 sponsees that we're working with to work out kind of the details of how we want to do this in a bigger scale for the community. But there are factors that you might want to consider with a sponsorship opportunity, especially if it's a one-time arrangement or if it's going to be an ongoing relationship, right? So make sure that whatever relationship you have with the fiscal sponsor is positive, not toxic for whatever reason, or where they are being too controlling of the things you need and want out of the relationship. And also, you really have to think of it as like, is this going to be advantageous for us to collaborate or work together beyond just getting the cash from this grant or from this pool of donations, right? So just something that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation today. Why would you use a fiscal sponsorship? So in addition to being able to apply for grants and give your donors a tax break, there's a lot of other things that you may want to consider with fiscal sponsorship. Many fiscal sponsor companies or organizations that do sponsorship can mentor and teach you which is very important, right? That gives you the tools to learn how to write your own grants better on your own one day, or reach out to donors better on your own one day. And that's invaluable knowledge that you can take with you even after the end of that sponsorship relationship. Sponsors also may just have more resources and grant seeking skills than you. Here at TCA, for example, myself and our development manager, Brandon, collectively have like close to 40 years of grant writing experience between our two belts that you just inherit automatically if we're your fiscal sponsor. So those are things that, you know, I think are very important and helpful right out the gate, especially if you're new to the grants writing world. Also, sponsors can help you stay organized and help you monitor your budget. So a lot of Tyco artists and Tyco groups are really great at the Tyco part, but the finances, the admin, the business stuff is kind of like eating your vegetables. Not everyone is as eager to do those things and do it consistently. So your sponsor may be able to provide you things like templates on how to balance your budget or this, that, or the other that you could use long term. And those are all very helpful things that, again, you can take away with you even after the sponsorship relationship is ended. So there are many different types of fiscal sponsorship models. We're going to highlight three today that I have been a big fan of and I've been on both sides of in the arts industry. These tend to work the best with arts groups and cultural groups. So we'll just get right into those. Uh, they're called models A, B, and C, and this is derived from a book called Fiscal Sponsorship: 6 Ways to Do It Right. This is by Colvin and Petit. These two literally wrote the book on fiscal sponsorships with nonprofits, and the 6 models that they use are widely used across different industries and communities of service. But A, B, and C, like I said specifically, I've used for artists and musicians in the past. So model A is called a direct project. And in a nutshell, the project belongs to the sponsor, but it is implemented by its employees and volunteers, which would be the Tyco group or artists. The project itself is not a legal entity, and it is basically considered for legal reasons an employer-employee relationship. The donations are all received by the sponsor in all 3 of these models. The sponsor's liability to third parties, because they're the employer and they own everything, they also inherit all of the legal liability. And that would be for the Tyco group or the artists involved too, because they're considered employees of that sponsor. At the end of the day, for Model A, it's pretty much all about the sponsor across the board. They would file any tax paperwork on this document. Individual employees would file their own 1040s. So that would be any Tyco group members that work on this project that's sponsored in this way. And legally, the project is no different than any other activity that that sponsor is already doing and owning directly. This works in some scenarios, but that might not be giving full control to your sponsor might not be something you want. So then you move into more blended models like B, which is an independent contractor project. The project still belongs to the sponsor, but is conducted totally separate by an entity under contract. So instead of being an employer and employee relationship, you're looking at a client and a contractor relationship, which makes the project itself its own legal entity. Because of that, the sponsor may be liable to do certain things legally, but you as the contractor would also be too. The ownership, right, the final deliverable, if you will, of the project ultimately does still go back to the sponsor. And as a result, the sponsor would file the tax paperwork accordingly. As a contractor, you would be legally and taxably beholden to any requirements as a contractor in your state. And the project can be done by one independent contractor, which would be a group, or it could be an individual artist, for example. This model actually is less commonly used than models A and C because of the complex legal relationships that contractors have and because contractor law varies greatly from state to state. But I'm just sharing that that's one of the ones that I've seen in the past. Model C is the pre-approved grant relationship. So the project applies to get sponsorship for one grant or a series of grants to fund the project. The sponsor funds the project from money received from donors and/or grant money. The project itself is a legal entity, and the relationship is like grantor and grantee. The charitable donations, again, are received by the sponsor, and the sponsor is liable for a selection of project grants plus the terms set by any grant funders. So we'll use TCA as an example. Let's say that who's with us today? Let's say Kurt gets a grant for Shango Mountain Taiko through TCA as their fiscal sponsor. TCA would not only collect that money from that funder, but any reporting requirements that funder has, anything that we are responsible for as being a receiver of money from them, falls on TCA. But then we distribute that money to Kurt, and we follow up to make sure that Kurt is doing what is supposed to be done with that money per those regulations. TCA in this scenario, in Model C scenario, right, would adopt doing all the taxes as well. The project itself may also be required for grant circumstances to have separate tax paperwork. And the project ownership depends on the relationship with the sponsor. In TCA's case, because we use a Model C approach, we give all legal IP and ownership to the Tyco group. It is not something that we intend to keep, nor do we own, but that could vary depending on who you partner with. This is the most common one used by nonprofits or 501c3s to help raise, again, tax-deductible donations, money from private foundations, and then, of course, federal and government grants. Again, these are 3 of many. I've seen probably in my career about 11 different approaches to fiscal sponsorship. And depending on industry and depending on the partners involved, they can work really great. So this is not for me to promote any one of these over the other, but I will say in transparency, because that's a core value here at TCA, that we definitely have adopted the Model C approach. And to break that down a little bit further, just so that everyone's clear, right? If you had to list it in a pros or cons situation from the point of view of like a Tyco group or a Tyco artist, the direct project Model A gives the sponsor the most control of the money received and how to spend it. So if you're a sponsor, that's pretty great, right? The sponsor also owns the project at the end, which is a pro for the sponsors. But a con, right? It treats all sponsored entities as internal projects. So if you're on the Tyco group side of this, applying for fiscal sponsorship, you could be signing up for something where you end up not even owning your concert footage afterwards, right? So definitely read the footnotes and the fine print on any type of agreement, as with anything else, but especially with fiscal sponsorship. With a Model B, where you would be a contractor potentially, project still belongs to the sponsor and it gives the sponsor flexibility. So those are pros for the sponsor. But the con for the Tyco group, right? Sponsors still may be liable legally for actions. If you treat contracted employees like your own employees, there's a lot of overlap there in terms of like, well, do we have to provide health for this Tyco group now while they're doing the project? And there's a lot of cool businessy legally things that start to get in gray area with Model B approach. And of course, tax implications for each one of those too. The Model C has a lot of pros as well. This one can be used to apply for a single project or a series of projects from the same entity. And that goes for grants too. You can apply for a single grant or for multiple grants for the same project. So there's some flexibility there. The sponsor can still control the who and the how, right? So they can still control who is getting that money dispersed to them, how it is being received. Most of the time, this is done as like a reimbursement or for pre-approved reasons, right? And we'll get more into that with funneling later in this presentation. But the sponsor does have some control over how the money is being spent to make sure that, I'll use Kurt again because we used him in an earlier example, to make sure that Kurt doesn't use grant money to go have a tailgating party after one of the games or something like that instead, right? It has to be for the project and per the outlines of a grant. Also, if donors donated to Shango Mountain Taiko and that's what they were using the donations for, that may not go over well either, right? So the sponsor does have some level of oversight in a Model C still. However, the sponsor is not legally liable for the actions of the grantee or the sponsee. This takes away some, I think, pain points for the fiscal sponsor, and also gives that control and autonomy back to the Taiko group or artists themselves. A con of this model, though, just to be transparent, the sponsor needs to be clearly set up with the right legal forms and understand the grantee's legal statuses to know the tax implications. Everybody's tax situation is a little different and unique. So to say that who else is in the room, to say that Kurt versus Paul versus Karen are going to have the same legal relationship with the same fiscal sponsor. That's not necessarily true if their tax situations look different from group to group or from artist to artist. And the project outcome, the assets and the results, if you will, of an outcome belong to the grantee or project. So that can be a con for a fiscal sponsor, but here at TCA, we actually think that that's a positive because we're here to empower the people and advance the art of taiko. We want everyone to keep their things just where they are. However, I've seen with Model C that a lot of times that sponsors and grantees end up having some type of share agreement or licensing agreement to use those project outcomes in a mutually beneficial way, which is pretty awesome. So there's there's so many things you could ask truly before picking a fiscal sponsor, but I always go back to gut instinct. So your level of comfort, your level of trust with a fiscal sponsor is super important. And my experience in the past really comes down to three like veins of questions that you would want to ask before you sign paperwork and shake hands on something with any fiscal sponsor, right? Number one, of course, is the legal concerns. Ask yourself or your group, like, what are we going to be liable for in this relationship? Maybe your group doesn't have the resources or the capacity to handle any legal risk. So it would be better to have a sponsor that takes all that on for you. Maybe you want to have legal or liable control of what your group does, how it does its business, this, that, or the other. So you'd want a more lenient sponsor in this way, right? The second question is related to, I call it internal operations, right? But who's controlling the spending of the money and who's controlling the receiving of the money? These are in a fiscal sponsorship relationship, usually two different people, right? The sponsor always is going to be receiving the funds, but are they the ones that are spending it, or do you have the freedom to spend that? And what does that look like? Is that only through reimbursement? Are they able to pay those things off in advance so that you're not putting a lot of out-of-pocket expenses in the relationship? You're going to want to find like what your ideal scenario looks like for you, and then go to a sponsor to see if it lines up accordingly. The third line of questions I always ask is related to reporting, right? So that's not just about taxes and who has to file them. It's who's going to write the final reports for grants that you get, because those can happen way after a project is over when those grants are due. Are you still in contact even with your fiscal sponsor at that point? Yes or no? And then the bookkeeping is kind of managing the money going in and money going out day to day. Is that something that you're comfortable doing or even want to do? Or is that something you're going to rely and trust your fiscal sponsor to do for you? So these are really important questions to consider. Of course, every group also has different prerogatives in this way, or every artist. So there's not one right set of answer to these questions. It's what's right for you. Now we're going to briefly talk about like good versus bad fiscal sponsors. I've worked with probably close to like 24 fiscal sponsors on both sides of the fence. And I've seen relationships sour very quickly or miscommunications blow up very quickly. And a lot of it could be avoided if you kind of know what flags to look out for in advance too. So we're just going to briefly share some of that. No surprise, right? A very good fiscal sponsor is going to be collaborative and communicative. If you have very clear understanding and expectations, and they've explained it to you, not in like high level legalese, right? You know, in very clear terms what you're going to be responsible for in the partnership. That's a good fiscal sponsor, right? To that end, you would also want somebody that's thorough and organized, because if they are being tasked to manage your bookkeeping or your finances, those are good skills to have in anybody that is doing that. So I highly recommend those four key traits. Bad fiscal sponsors, in my experience, usually are the ones that are very controlling. So these are the ones that put a lot of obstacles or red tape in the process of getting reimbursed the money that you've earned on your behalf, right? There's also high rates. So let's talk about that for a brief second. This varies from industry to industry, but right now, on average in the arts, 10% seems to be an average rate for a fiscal sponsor. I've seen organizations that mark as high as 25% fiscal sponsorship rates. And those are, I think, organizations that are more predatory. And that's the only thing they're doing is providing fiscal sponsorship to any group that comes at them. And that leans more like it feels icky, like it's a funneling type of organization, which I know I keep bringing up that term. We'll get to it in just a minute. So really avoid anything higher than 10%, in my opinion, for a fiscal sponsor. Also, if your fiscal sponsor is not about your mission, long term, that could have a greater wedge in the relationship that just keeps growing over time. They're going to want to push XYZ, or they may not understand why this expense is relevant to your project and your mission because they are just so far away from it, they don't understand, right? And that could be problematic. And of course, it makes sense, right? Poor communication. So if you reach out to your sponsor and they don't get back to you in a timely manner, they forget who I worked with a group who the fiscal sponsor forgot the name of their sponsee, like just crazy stuff, right? You don't want to be in business with anyone like that anyway, but especially in a fiscal sponsorship relationship where money's on the line. So funneling, we are finally there. What is funneling? Funneling is a term that's used to describe an organization that simply passes money through to their sponsee without any checks or balances. This is in other contexts similar to money laundering, where there's like a shell organization, right, that takes in money and just is channeling it to other places with wild abandon, and there's no checks or balances in how that money is being used or spent. While this is the easiest relationship for people receiving money on that back end, of course, it also can get both the fiscal sponsor and the group, or you, in a lot of legal hot water. So funneling has caused organizations to lose their nonprofit statuses, and it's also caused groups who've been sponsored to lose all future grant and donation possibilities with specific groups of funders. So this is something, if the whole purpose of a fiscal sponsorship relationship is to get you access to more fundraising resources, partnering with a funneling organization could do the exact opposite. And we don't want that to happen. So my simple advice here is to look for those red flags, look for that language and the clauses in the fine print with a fiscal sponsor. And if you get any like prickly hairs on the back of your neck that this sounds like passing through or a funneling organization, just don't even engage with them. It will be super tempting because they'll say how swift and easy it is to get your money and this, that, or the other. But there are actual beneficial reasons to having like an oversight or reporting element to a fiscal sponsorship relationship. And finally, like tips and tricks. My number one thing with finances and fundraising of any kind is know your own personal limits. If the relationship with a fiscal sponsor is really only going to work well for you if you raise like $1 million in grants that year, are you going to raise $1 million in grants that year? Like, ask, what is the likelihood of it? How many grants are you going to have to apply for and then have to do work to support that grant money? Does that make sense for you and your group, or you as an individual artist? Yes or no? Tips and tricks number 2, please do an initial pass of grant seeking before partnering with anyone. Have a general idea of things that are available to you that you could qualify for with a fiscal sponsor. Because if they paint this lovely picture and they're going to find all these resources for you, and you fact check them on this, and you're like, I know for a fact I can apply for these grants right now if I had a fiscal sponsor, and they're not even on that sponsor's radar, maybe they're not fully aligned to what you're seeing as your value and where you could get funding from. Now, that being said, they could also blow your mind and give you a lot of options that you didn't realize were available to you. And that's good. If you've done research and they're able to give you more beyond that, that's a really good sign for a fiscal sponsor. Tip and trick number 3, really understand, again, knowing your limits, right? Do you want to receive donations only or just grants only? Do you want a combination of these things? This will help you kind of put a boundary in place of the terms of relationship you want to have with a fiscal sponsor. In my experience with Tyco groups, most want to be able to do both, like receive donations and apply for the occasional grant if it applies and suits them, right? That type of flexibility with a fiscal sponsorship relationship is more an ongoing relationship versus a project-based relationship. So just food for thought on when you start looking for different fiscal sponsors and what that could look like. Number 4, Remember, even though the sponsor has something you need, right? That coveted tax exempt status, right? They also need to make a good case to you about how they are going to serve you. And this is right, not just the grants and the donations, but are they going to provide you any mentorship or templates or resources to teach you how to be stronger when you come out of this relationship with them? I think organizations that are willing to share knowledge as well as the tax ID, that's a really good sign to me in terms of a fiscal sponsorship relationship. And then, of course, the final tip and trick I have for today is what besides money could you potentially get out of the partnership? Then we've talked about mentorship and templates, but maybe by working with this fiscal sponsor who's well connected in your community, you're now networked and plugged into maybe talking with those funders you want to get grants from, or potential audience, like expanding your audience, right? New clients that you could perform for, or venues, right? You want to work with. There's something to say about like looking at this relationship as a strategic advantage for you and your group long term as well. And we focus so much on the money aspect of a fiscal sponsorship that holistically we forget to look at some of the other aspects of that relationship too. So that is my very high level fiscal sponsorships 101. And there's a million questions probably beyond that. So we're going to open it to questions.